All right, everybody, welcome to the first of about 6 different screencasts for Chapter 7. These are going to be mostly a lot shorter than the ones from some of the previous chapters. We're going to be comparing different voting methods. And so what I'm going to try to do is basically cut this where each video is a different voting method. Actually, I group a couple of them because they're highly related, but for the most part, each video will be a different voting method, and that way, if you want to come back and look at these individually for help on the homework or what have you, you can do that. So here we go, a little bit of an introduction here in the first video. So we already know that the way we count up votes can determine the outcome, right? We saw that with the Condorcet vote cycle. The agenda and the way that we take the votes can determine the outcome. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take that issue head on, and instead of just looking at pairwise majority rule, which is what we looked at with the Condorcet vote cycle or the Condorcet paradox, we're going to look at completely different methods of voting. So majority rule, pairwise majority rule is just one way of voting. We've talked about unanimity rule also, where everyone has to prefer an alternative to the status quo in order to defeat the status quo. But there are lots of other types of voting methods, and you probably are familiar with them from different ways you've maybe decided to do things in clubs or on committees or even amongst your friends. When I was in grad school, when we would decide to go to lunch, we would I would kind of make up a different little voting rule every day. Not every day, but once a week, and that's how we would decide. And we always ended up at the tie place. So, and there's a reason why. So we'll talk about why sometimes these voting rules may give us all the same answer and why sometimes they don't. We'll talk about that as we go. So we're going to see that for the same group of people. So I'm going to basically put up a group of people. I'm going to tell you what their preferences are, and then we're going to use different voting rules to aggregate those preferences into a group choice. All right. And so between the votes, I'm not letting them change their vote. I'm not letting them be strategic. All the things that would happen in the real world, of course, when people are voting. But for this example, it's easier to see why we're getting different outcomes if I hold their preferences constant across the different scenarios. And then if we let them change their preferences, or in reality we would say let them be strategic and misrepresent their preferences. In other words, they would vote for something they like less, maybe in one round of voting, in order to get what they want at the end. That's what we're talking about here. If we allowed that, these results just get stronger. The differences between the voting rules just get stronger for the most part. So for these videos and for these examples, I'm going to be holding the preferences of the voter constant. And here are going to be the 6 types of rules we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about simple plurality voting. So we're going to be looking at multiple alternatives at a time. And so it's not pairwise. We're going to be looking at a set of 5 or 6 votes at a time. Majority rule doesn't always give you a choice if there are more than 2 alternatives, right? If there are 3 alternatives and each one gets 33%, 33%, and the last one gets 34% of the vote, well, majority rule returns nothing. Majority rule returns an empty choice set. Sometimes people say majority rule returns all of them as the choice set. Either way, we don't really have a choice, right, in terms of what the group wants. So usually when there are multiple alternatives, we talk about plurality voting. So plurality voting is when an alternative with the most votes wins. That's at least simple plurality voting. Then we come down to plurality runoff. So sometimes we don't just say whichever one gets the most votes wins. We will take that as the first round, right? And so that's what plurality runoff is going to do. And then what it does is it takes the plurality vote and then it takes the top 2, throws all the other alternatives out, and then revotes. So everyone basically gets to vote on the top 2 in the second round. It may have been their top choice in the first round, may have been their least favorite choices in the first round, but they get to vote on those last 2. A lot of the primaries in Georgia actually work this way. There's a name for it when they talk about primary votes, and it slips my mind what it's called, the particular type of primary. Louisiana used to use it. I don't think they still do. Georgia is one of the few states that actually still does this, where if in a primary there is no one who gets a simple majority. They do a runoff between the top two. California does this, I think, for their governor's races. It's a weird thing where they can actually end up with two people from the same party running against one another. But in any event, that's plurality runoff. You run the simple plurality, and then you take the top two and you run the ballot again. Sequential runoff is another version of this. In sequential runoff, what happens is you run the plurality vote, and then you throw out the bottom, the person who gets the least number of votes in the first round. And then you vote again. And you just keep doing that until you have two, and then you run the plurality voting. It's actually a majority rule at that point with only two alternatives, and then that is the group choice. So all of those are kind of related. They all at least start with a simple plurality vote, and then these bottom two have second rounds. This one has a second round plurality runoff, and then sequential runoff may have multiple rounds depending on how many alternatives that we start with. A different type of method is called the board account. A board account is completely different than plurality, any of the plurality family of voting rules. In board account, everyone gives points. And usually you give points, so say there are 5 alternatives, you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all right? You can also do 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. That's in the social choice literature, that's the technical way they define it usually. You get the number of points for the number of alternatives that are below that alternative in your preference ranking. But for us, I don't like starting to count at 0. I'm not a computer scientist, it confuses me. So I'm just gonna do 5 points, 4 points, 3 points, 2 points, 1 point if there are 5 alternatives. If there were 7 alternatives, you would give your favorite 7, your next favorite 6, your third favorite 5, 4, all the way down, right? Board account requires a strict preference ordering, or at least it requires you to vote using a strict ordering. So if you had 2 alternatives you were indifferent between, board account would require you to pick which one ranked higher than the other. Board account doesn't allow for indifference in the actual casting of the votes when a voter does that. There are other versions of board account that have allocating points. There are some where it's like here you have 10 points, allocate those 10 points across these 3 alternatives. So there you can have indifference, but we're not going to do that one today. We're just going to have board account. Another one is Condorcet procedure. So the Condorcet procedure was designed by the Marquis de Condorcet in order to try to determine, is there a Condorcet winner? The Marquis de Condorcet and a lot of social choice theorists since then have made the argument that if there is a Condorcet winner, something that cannot be defeated in pairwise majority rule, then that should be the group choice, that it has some normative weight to it, that's a very compelling argument that if this thing can't be beaten by anything else pairwise, maybe it's the group choice. I don't really know if I buy into that, but in any event, the Condorcet procedure was designed to find a Condorcet winner if it exists. If there is no Condorcet winner, the Condorcet procedure returns nothing. In social choice and voting, we say it's not decisive. It doesn't give us a group choice sometimes. So that is one of the downsides of using the Condorcet procedure is if there is no Condorcet winner, what do we do? There is a variation on it that looks at which alternative wins the most pairwise votes, and that's called the Copeland rule. We're not going to look at that one in this extended example that I'm going to do. We're just going to look at the Condorcet procedure. And then the last one we're going to look at is called approval voting. In approval voting, you take the list of alternatives and you give a 1 to everything you would accept or that you approve of, and you give a 0 for all the ones you don't accept or don't approve of, and then we add everything up. All right. I think I forgot to mention that, actually that's important with the board account, is that after everyone ranks the alternatives, so let's go back to board account, sorry, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for 5 alternatives, you sum up everyone's points. All right, and that's how you make the group choice. Sorry, that was a big omission there. Okay, back down to approval voting. In approval voting, you cast a 1 if you approve, a 0 otherwise. So you could vote 1 for all of them, you could vote 0 for all of them, you can do whatever you want. 1 for things you approve of, 0 otherwise. And then you sum up all the points across the voters, and that gives you the group's choice. One of the issues with approval voting and board account is it can give you more than one group choice. It will give you a group choice, but the choice set, meaning the set of things that is chosen by the group, can be more than one. It's not always going to be a unique group choice. So what we're going to see with this is that we're going to get different group choices using these different rules. For the same group of people, we're going to get different group choices. Now when I do this live in a classroom, I have everybody log on to a Google survey, and I have everybody rank different types of candy. And then I run their rankings through these different voting rules. So as we go through this example I have pre-prepared, we also look at the preferences of the people in the classroom. I obviously can't do that in this class because this is videoed, but anyways, that's what I usually do. I usually show that in this example I'm going to show you, actually, we're going to get a different group choice for every voting rule, spoiler alert. But in real world classes, we often, there's some clustering, there's some grouping of the preferences over different types of candies. And we end up with two or three of the alternatives will win under all the different voting rules. In fact, I've had a case where for the particular class I had, the same candy won for all of them. So it's not going to always be the case that we get a different group choice depending on the voting rule, but the moral of the story here is that it's very possible that the voting rule determines the outcome, not the preferences of the voters. The method of preference aggregation can matter a great deal, and we've talked about this idea before of, is this idea of the will of the people very well defined? And as it turns out, if there's much difference in the preferences of the voters, then it's not well defined. You will get a different group choice depending on the method that you use, the voting rule, and sometimes the agenda, as we've already seen with the Condorcet vote cycle. So the method of preference aggregation can matter a great deal. Each method we are going to look at will select a different outcome as the group choice. The voters' preferences are going to be the same in all cases, and there are often other strange things that can happen, right? Sometimes the Condorcet winner, the thing that always wins in pairwise, will actually lose in plurality rule. So this was a case, a couple of political scientists wrote a paper about this during the 2016 primaries about Trump, and they said Trump is a Condorcet loser. And their argument was that there were several of the other candidates in the Republican primaries that would have beat Trump one-on-one, right? But when he was running using plurality rule, which is what most primaries use, then he was able to win a whole bunch of those because he had the biggest plurality within the party. So that's strange though, right? Because Condorcet argued, and a lot of social choice theorists argue, that if there's a Condorcet winner, then there's some normative pull that should be the group choice. But plurality rule won't always give you that, all right? And so given that the rule itself can determine the outcome, what is the will of the people? What does that even have a meaning? So one more thing I'll add before we go into the different voting rules is, well, then how do you select a good rule? Well, it's not always clear. Now, in some circumstances, there's clearly a bad rule, and there can clearly be bad ways of making a group choice. Usually we think of a dictatorship where one person's preferences outweigh everyone else's as a bad rule. But outside of those sorts of really obvious things, how do we pick a rule? Sometimes it just depends on what you're trying to get done. What if you want to economize on time? Some of these rules, as you're going to see, take a while to run. I used to do this on the board before I wrote some code to aggregate everyone's preferences. I used to do the candy game, is what I call it. I used to do it on the board, and it would take a long time to run some of these voting rules. So some of these voting rules aren't very good in terms of time. They have multiple rounds, and they require people to keep voting over and over. Also, another thing is maybe we're being strategic when we pick the rule. I love it when I'm in a faculty meeting or on a search committee, and they go, well, how should we vote on this? And they turn to me and say, hey, Reagan, you know all about voting rules. Which voting rules should we pick? Well, I know the properties of these voting rules. I basically know my colleagues' preferences over different types of policies and usually different types of candidates for jobs. And so I could pick a voting rule that might give the best choice of me getting what I want. So I'll always volunteer to be the person who decides what the voting rule should be. Another thing to think about is that the choice of a rule can also affect the strategy of the candidates, right? We know this from the real world, right? In 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College. And a lot of people said, well, this just shows that she should have won. And the Trump campaign, I think rightly, came back and said, well, no, we played using the rules of the game, right? The rules of the game were the Electoral College. And that was no secret. And right, it's not like we applied this voting mechanism after everyone voted, right? So we campaigned in a certain way. And so you can't just say after the fact that we should have lost, right? So the choice of the rule can affect the strategy of the candidate. If there's a chance for a runoff or rankings are used, then more candidates may actually come forward because they might have a shot at actually winning. This is especially true in approval voting, right? We find that approval voting tends to incentivize more different and diverse candidates for running because they think there's probably more of a chance that they might win. And of course, that may or may not be a good thing depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish and what side of a particular issue that you're on. Sometimes you want lots of a diversity of candidates, but sometimes you don't. And we're going to look at that issue more. Well, actually, we won't. We're not doing that chapter in this particular class, but if you're in a class where we're going to do full electoral systems, we'll look at the different properties of those voting systems as a whole, not electoral systems as a whole, not just voting rules. We'll see how some of them cause candidates to tend to move toward the middle of the distribution of preferences, and some of those electoral systems cause candidates to move toward the edges in those electoral systems, causing polarization. The one last thing I'll mention here is that these voting rules also can induce people to vote strategically or not vote strategically, right? Approval voting is a classic where there's a big incentive to vote strategically sometimes. Voting ones for everything and voting zeros for everything means that you will have no say in the outcome if you're a voter in an approval voting system. So sometimes people in approval voting systems will just vote for one candidate, even though they might approve of some of the others. That is the thing that gives their one vote the most weight in terms of determining the outcome. In a multi-round plurality system like plurality runoff or plurality sequential, sequential runoff, and I'm forgetting my names. Yeah, in plurality runoff or sequential runoff, sometimes people will, especially sequential, they will vote, they will change the order of their votes in between rounds. And now in the examples I'm going to show you in the next few videos, there's a little preview. In the next few videos, I'm not going to allow people to do that. But in the real world, certain voting rules can encourage people to be strategic in terms of their voting rule. And there is actually a social choice theorem called the Gibbard-Saderwhite theorem that says that almost all voting rules are subject to strategic voting and can be strategically manipulated. Some of them make it really hard, though. So we'll talk about that and some of those properties as we go through these different videos. So before we move on, let me give you the voter preferences that I'm going to use for the next set of videos. So in all of those videos, the voters are going to have these preferences, all right? And so how do we read this little table here? Well, this is preference profile number 1. So this represents all voters in this group who strictly prefer hot tamales to Skittles. They strictly prefer Skittles to Lindt truffles. They strictly prefer Lindt truffles to Reese's Cups, and they strictly prefer Reese's Cups to Baby Ruth. And there are 18 voters who have that strict preference ordering. So for preference profile number 2, there are 12 voters who strictly prefer Baby Ruth to Lindt truffles. They strictly prefer Lindt truffles to Skittles. They strictly prefer Skittles to Reese's Cups, and they strictly prefer Reese's Cups to hot tamales, right? So that's how you read this. This is their preference ordering, best to worst. And this is the number of voters who have that preference ordering. So there are 10 people who have this particular preference ordering or who have this particular preference profile. That's how you read this. And then in green, when it comes to approval voting, right, each set of voters is going to basically set a threshold and say, everything above that threshold I approve of, and everything below I don't approve of. So that's what's in green here. I have their approval basically votes. So they vote for these, they vote 0 for these two in terms of preference profile number 6 over here that has 2 voters who would approve of Lindt truffles, they would approve of Reese's Cups, they would approve of Skittles, but they do not approve of Baby Ruth and hot tamales. So they give 1, 1, 1, 0, 0 in terms of their votes. All right, so that's it for this first one, and I'll start up on the next videos in a moment. I'll see you then.